Hi, everybody. This is Richard Sachs. Thanks for waiting for us. We're a couple of minutes over, and glad to see you here this morning. I just wanted to let you know that in January of this year, we had an incredibly interesting and informative guest that we had a lot of questions and good feedback on, and people were wondering about getting him back, and we finally got a chance to do that. You might remember, or if you weren't around, you could go back and look at the archive. Lost Arts Radio, and the guest, whose name is Anthony Patch. And he's a researcher and reporter. His website is easy to remember. It's anthonypatch.com. He's also the founder of an electronic magazine called Entangled. I think I got that right.
Yep.
And we're going to find out what that means and get into an array of different interesting subjects that could come from artificial intelligence issues that are really relevant in today's world and are expanding rapidly. What's going on with cryptocurrencies and the blockchain, that people are divided on. Some think that it's going to, free humanity, will never be surveilled or controlled again. Everything's going to be great. And the other people are saying, well, yeah, except for the fact that that's going to control everything and you're being tricked into it. So we might get into that. And quantum mechanics, why is that different than quantum physics? DNA, RNA modification, which is connected to the whole deeper level of the GMO issue, and maybe even 5G, which I think almost everybody on the show is really interested in, because it's about to be rolled out not only on the Earth, but also theoretically from satellites, lots and lots of satellites, for your convenience, making it impossible to escape the radiation. So I think we have enough for at least a 10-hour show, and we'll see what we can do in a little piece of that. So thank you for being here, Anthony, and I'm really looking forward to our talk. I think it'll be great.
No, thank you, my friend. It's always a pleasure to be with you, Richard. Thank you for the invitation.
Yeah, neat. So, out of the list of things that I talked about, I don't have a sequence in mind. It can be anything that you're particularly interested in right now, so something that you've been thinking about. Any of those subjects are a place to start, although if you want, we could start on the one that is not on your website, to my knowledge, and then see anything that you want to say about that and how, if at all, it's connected to the other ones. And that would be the latest version of the EMF fields that they're going to start generating, and the millimeter wave frequencies known as 5G. So any observations on that would be a starting point.
Sure. I think what's really relevant to your audience is the biological effects. And this is where we're looking at the breakdown at the cellular level because of the microwave effect of 5G millimeter wave. When we think of a microwave oven in our kitchen, literally this is the wavelength, the frequency, not the amplitude, not the power level, but the frequencies that we're looking at and the wavelengths that we're looking at when we talk about 5G. With our cell phones, we began when cell phones kind of moved from sort of that brick-sized cell phone in the late 80s and early 90s. Those were 2G. And then we advanced through the 90s into 3G, early 2000s 4G, and that was kind of the benchmark standard, 4G, for quite a while. And now we're just moving
Anthony,
into 5.
You mentioned that the first one was 2G. Why did they start on 2, or was there a 1?
I'm not aware of a 1, only in the things that I have been reading, and I read the literature. I read the peer-reviewed white papers in the scientific journals, and sort of my forte is to translate it into something that is not quite so arcane. Right. And 2G is really, I think, where the first crossover from the military application of cell phone technology really moved into the public arena. So 1G may have existed and probably did in the military, but the first time I was aware of it was 2.
Okay, got it.
And, this refers to the amount of data. We're talking gigabytes of data that are the pipe, if you will. How big is the pipe of data that can flow through this system? And where it's become insidious, where it's become a real issue for us now, is that these are such intense forms of radiation. And we've heard of warnings of microwaving our own food. And it used to be in the old days when microwaves first came out and were much larger, they didn't have really any effective shielding. Right. So you were actually admonished to step. We were kind of joking before we went on the air, but step, 3 feet away from your microwave while it's operating. And there are still concerns about microwave ovens. But
I think they banned those for that reason in the Soviet Union, didn't they?
That's news to me, but it wouldn't surprise me.
Yeah, they called them radiation ovens, and they outlawed them.
That would make sense. Essentially what it is a very large magnet. It's a donut-shaped magnet in there. So we are talking about significant power, and that relates to what 5G is being rolled out as, the way that it's being rolled out. The characteristics of 5G are that they don't penetrate walls real well. When we think of radio waves that we pick up on AM and FM, or even our Wi-Fi, that tends to move through walls fairly well. But because of the very short wavelength that we're talking about, it has difficulty penetrating walls, so you oftentimes have to have repeaters. In a business environment, and especially in the universities where they've been first rolled out, interestingly, 5G repeaters, typically about every 100 feet you have to put a repeater up, depending on the location in the buildings.
Okay.
The insidious part is that now local cities, counties, the local jurisdictions are being pushed out of the decision-making process as to where to place these repeater sites, these transmitters. And in fact, what they're doing is claiming almost like eminent domain, in the sense that the city owns the sidewalk. You're supposed to, as a resident, maintain, that area, but it literally is owned by the city. And so they feel that they can put up a transmitting tower on a sidewalk location in front of a home in a suburban neighborhood without any due process, without any public comment, because it's coming from the federal level. And late last year, Donald Trump, in a very famous press conference, was approached by two industry leaders from the 5G world and implored him to sign an executive order to cut through the red tape at the local level, city and county, for the rollout of 5G, because it was they didn't necessarily call it, something like a national security issue, but you could see that they almost wanted to use that verbiage. But they said it was critical to the building out of our infrastructure. And this is what Donald Trump has been really rallying behind since he took office, is pushing this rebuilding of America's infrastructure. Mm-hmm. So 5G is rolled into that discussion, and they have been cutting the red tape. They've eliminated public comment, and therefore, as I said, sort of this eminent domain type process. We are now facing these transmitting towers literally outside our homes that operate the same as a microwave oven, do have the ability to damage us at the cellular level, at our mitochondria, to break down the cellular wall. And in essence, you're talking about things like cancer as a result. Now, in the world of conspiracy theorists, and that's a CIA pejorative statement, we've all been programmed as a hot button word, but in that sort of realm, and I'll be a little nicer and say the truther community, the discussion has been for the larger towers that are placed in communities, not in front of a home, but in a larger installation. Why the oversized, excessive capacity electrical conduit, the electrical wiring that is running to the base and then up the towers to the transmitters? Because there have been many engineers who've indicated they don't need this much power for 5G. Well, again, to use the word insidious, if you think of these towers as a microwave oven, broadcasting a signal that literally can toast the population, Now we're kind of getting into that conspiracy theorist kind of genre of conjecture. But when you look at the cabling and you look at the kilovolts that are ready as a standby capacity of electricity to be transmitted through these 5G towers, it begs the question, why do they have the excess capacity?
Yeah, because that significantly changes the cost, doesn't it?
Mm-hmm.
They're willing to pay for way more than they apparently need.
Yeah, and it isn't so much going back to data transmission, it isn't so much as having a fat pipeline for increasing the amount of data that you can transmit through a 5G signal. This is just the raw power that is supplying electricity to the transmitters.
So before we get into what the transmitter could do with more power other than just transmit data, I want to try to fill in a gap in understanding that a lot of people brush over because they think there's no way they could understand it. But I think we could put it in common terms, and that is, if you have a wave kind of, going in like a sine wave type pattern, and it's either, let's tell people just so they have a point of reference, what's the amplitude and the other basic measurement units of this wave. And then once that is established and you got this wave kind of like a continuing S shape of some length, between the waves, how does that carry information? Because that's not information yet, that's just the open wave. If you put little superimposed shapes on that, now you're starting to talk about information transmission, right?
Right. So we're talking a binary zeros and ones, and we are superimposing a 0 or a 1 into that signal. So I'll be very simplistic about it. When we look at a wave, the height of the wave is the amplitude. The distance, so from the base of the wave to the peak of the wave, they call amplitude.
That's amplitude. Okay, how tall it is from the lowest point on the wave.
Right, and that would be a measure of the amount of force, the amount of electrical power there is.
Oh, okay.
Then
so give an example of some typical amplitudes, like between 2G and 5G, and I know it gets smaller and smaller.
Yeah, well, we're talking about moving from, let's say, a scale of an inch down to a millimeter.
Okay. So you're like an inch would be like 2G.
Right.
Okay.
And 5G being a millimeter wave, literally is measured in 1 to 2 millimeters.
So when there's more waves per second, does that mean they have to have less amplitude?
They can turn the amplitude down if they increase the frequency. So the next portion from amplitude is the frequency is a measure of the distance between the peak of the wave to the next peak of the next wave. So peak to peak, that distance determines the frequency.
And what's a typical distance between peaks, say starting with 2G up to 5?
I couldn't answer that right off the top of my head. We're talking about megahertz and gigahertz. In the case of G, we're talking gigahertz. So when we look at the electromagnetic spectrum, it is measured in megahertz and gigahertz and terahertz. Okay. So we're moving up in terms of thousands to 10,000s to hundreds of thousands to even in terms of giga, we are talking in terms of millions to trillions to quadrillions.
And that's number of waves in a second, right?
Right, per second. So a megahertz. So
the distance between them is going to be really small.
It's going to be very close together. Right.
Okay. All right.
So we have amplitude, the height. We have frequency, which is the distance from peak to peak. And that gives us really the picture of how much data can be embedded on this waveform. So if you increase the frequency, in other words, in a given second or in a space between peaks, the more peaks, the more ones and zeros you can assign to those peaks. So in a second, you can get more information at 1 megahertz, or less information at 1 megahertz versus 1 gigahertz. The gigahertz is giving you more, a higher frequency, in other words, more peaks closer together. And the more peaks closer together gives you more bits of information.
Okay. And the information is superimposed on the wave. So if you just sent that wave, at the other end, you couldn't decode anything, right? It would just be without information if it was just the wave itself.
Right. If you're just sending what they call a carrier signal, then there wouldn't be any information on that. But you could hear the carrier signal as static.
And how do you put information on a wave?
Well, this gets down almost to the quantum level, but I'll keep it very simple. It's the spin of the electrons and protons. So when you are talking about encoding information in a cell signal, you're talking about something called QAM, quaternary amplitude modulation. And without getting too complex about that, you're changing. Modulation means to change.
Okay.
The amplitude, you're changing that peak up and down.
The height of the signal, kind of.
Right. And as you change the height of the signal, it can represent either a 0 or a 1 depending on the height. So let's say the short amplitude, the low amplitude would be a 0, and the taller amplitude would represent a 1. And so if you are modifying or modulating that wavelength, you're then able to first send one wave that's a 0, and the next wave is a 1, but the 1 is at a higher amplitude. So you have two signals broadcast at once almost.
So they don't need to have the option of like having the amplitude be 10 or 9 or 8 or 7 or 6 or 5. They just want it to be either the big amplitude or the small one.
Well,
for a 1 or a 0, right?
Yeah. To be very simple about it, yes. When you get into quaternary, we're talking about the ability to superimpose 4 signals into one transmission burst. So a burst contains the zeros and ones. And you can change that in 4 steps, quaternary referring to 4. So you have that ability to have actually a 0, a 1, and then another 0 and another 1, but all at different heights, different wave heights or amplitudes.
Okay. So what's the difference between that way of transmitting, which is not like a bunch of little tiny signals along the wave, it's just a big wave or a small wave, 1, 2, or 3, or 4 of those going at the same time. And because there's so much frequency, you can transmit a lot of information. What's the difference between that and sending it through a copper wire or a fiber optic cable?
Sure. With fiber optic or with copper, you're dealing with resistance. Specifically in copper, you're dealing with resistance to the flow of electrons, which can cause distortion to the signal. You can lose some of your zeros and ones. You have resistance in the line. Fiber optic doesn't have that issue in terms of resistance because you're working with the flow of photons. But what you're trying to do with fiber optic is to pack in as many zeros and ones per second. Very close packing of photons. And the photons themselves are what are carrying the zeros and ones. It depends on the spin of the photon, and this is where we're getting into quantum mechanics. There's quantum particles have an upspin or a downspin, and photons can have a downspin and represent a 1, or they can have an upspin and represent a 0. What you're doing with fiber optics is you have the ability to pack those spinning photons very close together and therefore transmit much more information than you can through a copper transmission, a copper wire that's carrying information by way of electrons as opposed to photons. But to go back to the 5G, going beyond the capability of fiber optic, is the 5G in that in a given second, because we're measuring wavelengths and frequencies in cycles per second, within one cycle, you can pack in a lot more data, a lot more ones and zeros in 5G than you can even with fiber optic.
Okay. So that's how they say this is all wonderful and necessary for the world, like they were telling the president. And I don't think he knows anything other than that. He just thinks it's great for the economy and all that kind of stuff. And he's talked positively about the Internet of Things and all that. I don't think he has, at this point, any clue, like a lot of scientists don't, and other general public doesn't, that this might be suicidal for life on the planet.
Yeah, and just one more advantage from their perspective of using 5G versus even a fiber optic system is the fact that fiber optic, as you can appreciate, requires an awful lot of material and labor and cost in laying those fiber optic systems. 5G, all you have to do is put up a repeater site and you're done.
Yeah.
So the rollout is a lot faster and a lot less expensive, but it's at a price, and it is definitely affecting the biology of animals. I think a lot of what we see in the behavior of animals that is abnormal nowadays is because of the 5G broadcasts. And there was a recent story of I think it was in the Netherlands, of a test of the 5G system there, and they had a mass bird die-off.
All right.
So, from my perspective, just in a nutshell, I'm very much opposed to 5G, and on the horizon is 6G, which the military is already using.
Right. Yeah, and I mean, people have speculated, why would they just stop at a certain level and just keep raising and raising and raising it? And yeah, I totally agree. And the delicate communication within the body of not just humans and animals, but plants and trees and insects and everything is all dependent on a delicate system of intercellular communication. And I'm sure that, when you're jamming that, it's not without effects.
Absolutely. And, given your background, you understand that better than I do. What I'm looking at is really kind of the nuts and bolts end of it and how it all operates, but also what it portends for the human race as well as animals and really all forms of life. And I'll just take a quick leap, sorry about the pun, but quantum leap here for a second into quantum mechanics. And that is that when we talk about the cellular communication and interconnectivity of life forms, in quantum mechanics, this is where the title or the name of my magazine comes from, is quantum entanglement. And quantum entanglement exists throughout the universe. In essence, all matter is entangled. And the definition of entanglement, I'll kind of give you two here because Einstein, he called it, first of all, spooky action at a distance, because he didn't quite understand it and didn't have the technology we have today to understand it. But quantum entanglement has been proven empirically in the laboratory, and it has been proven even out now to satellite communication systems, predominantly with the Chinese, or notably with the Chinese. I'm sure our government has done the same, but it isn't necessarily as open about it as the Chinese, which is very ironic when we talk about openness and transparency in them.
Right.
But this is a fully encrypted, meaning unhackable form of communication signals between ground-based and satellite-based systems that the Chinese have announced late last year. But getting back specifically to you and I, we are quantum entangled. And what that means in the laboratory example is you can have two quantum particles. So let's be specific. Let's say we have a proton and another proton, and they're separated by any distance. And a proton is a component of an atom. We have the nucleus, which is made up of a neutron and a proton. So we take part of the nucleus of an atom, which would be a proton. We have one that's light years away and one that is right here. And the one that's right here in the laboratory, we alter its spin. Let's say it's spinning up, because there are two states of quantum spin, up and down. The one in the laboratory is spinning up, but we magnetically affect it. We use a microwave. And we'll talk about D-wave quantum computers because they use microwaves to magnetically change the spin of that proton from up to down. What's happened light years away is the other proton is immediately, with no time delay, is immediately affected. It changes its spin. Its spin was let's say down. Our particle was spinning up originally. Now it spins up and our particle is spinning down. So if we affect ours, the opposite effect happens at any distance and in the same moment. This is faster than the speed of light communication.
Right. There's no speed. It's instantaneous, right?
That's correct. And all particles are quantum entangled.
So that means basically everything's connected to everything else.
Literally in a quantum mechanical explanation, it is.
Just since you used that term a few times, so that people understand, because I'm sure you've noticed in general public, people throw around terms like quantum and it's like they know what it means, but usually they don't. And so what's the difference between two frequently used phrases, quantum mechanics and quantum physics?
Okay. When we talk about quantum physics, we're talking about the nature of the particles and the nature of the energy waves. In quantum physics, we're talking about, for example, the interesting phenomena. One of the hallmarks or building blocks of quantum physics is what is known as wave-particle duality, in which a wave can be a particle at the same time that particle can exhibit the characteristics of a wave. This gets into the double slit experiment and observation and changing or collapsing the waveform due to our observation, our detection, collapsing the waveform into matter, into a particle. So quantum physics is really the energy waves and the particles. When we talk about mechanics, we're talking about the laws that scientists have developed based upon theories, based upon empirical experiments, developing laws of behavior of those particles and laws of behavior for those energy waves. So it's the mechanical operation of the particles, the mechanical operation of the waveforms. But quantum, and I think this is where you were reaching, I wrote an article last month in Entangle magazine, kind of tongue-in-cheek, about how for many years we've tossed around another word called turbo.
Right, yeah.
Now, a turbo is a turbine, and that's used obviously in particular in diesel engines, but in gasoline engines. But in a diesel application originally, it's nothing more than an air compressor driven by the exhaust of the engine to force more air into the combustion chambers, increasing its power. All of a sudden, you start seeing turbo on software, like TurboTax.
Yeah. And people think that means better and faster, right?
Right. And so it becomes the common lexicon, within the common lexicon that we toss these around. Now they're doing it with quantum.
So we're going to have quantum tax pretty soon?
Well, I wouldn't doubt it. Sure, why not?
Okay.
Might have blockchain tax, so we'll get to that in a minute. But
so what does quantum actually mean?
Yeah, that's the question. So it's a measure, it's a quanta. Quantum means quanta. It means a measure of a substance. It means a quantity. It literally means a quantity. It's a measurement of particles or it's a measurement of energy waves. But it also refers to the measurement at a subatomic scale. And when we talk about subatomic, it literally means smaller than an atom. That's where the quantum mechanics and the quantum scale of measurement, like nanoscale, picoscale, or femtoscale measurements, begin to come into play. And this is where we're getting into, nano is a billionth of a meter. And then we go to a trillionth of a meter and a quadrillionth of a meter. We keep going down smaller and smaller. That's all in the realm of quantum mechanics. And that is where we hear something else that's very common, especially in computing, is classical versus quantum mechanics. Classical mechanics, the classical model of the universe, relates to atoms and molecules, that scale. When we go below the atomic scale, we go into now the quantum mechanics, so classical versus quantum mechanics. It's all about measurement, really, is the differentiation.
Okay. All right, good. So what you were starting to relate that to what's going on with 5G in some way. I'm not sure where you were about to go with it.
Well, in the sense that, 5G is dealing with still the millimeter classical scale of measurement. We're not talking nanometer, but this is where it's headed, because when we talk beyond 5G in transmitting of data, when we start into the realm of within the Internet of Things, what is known as edge computing, EDGE, edge computing. We're now talking about, at the edge of the Internet, sensors that are embedded. And these sensors are embedded everywhere and will continue to be embedded everywhere. And these are devices, literally, that are measuring the changes in the environment in which they're placed. So it may be measuring an energy, or it may be a flow of particles, like a chemical sensor. But these are sensors that are a billionth of a meter in size. So typically they're around 10 to 15 nanometers in scale. And again, much smaller than an atom. And these are taking us beyond 5G, but they do communicate with 5G. What is happening with edge computing is what is known as a limited scale computing. The sensor itself is not just transmitting information through the 5G system, through the 5G bandwidth, back to a cloud-based server system. These nanosensors are performing a rudimentary level of computation. Then they're burst transmitting that information through 5G signals. The reason that they're computing at the source is to lessen the impact, reduce the impact on the bandwidth through 5G. So they're really only transmitting the essentials, not the whole thing.
So these transmitters, the nanotransmitters, how does that relate to the Internet of Things?
Well, the Internet of Things began with this idea of, connecting our refrigerators and connecting our smart meters was really the one in the public arena that caught a lot of attention. Right. Smart meters are connected by the Internet. That's an extension of, our Wi-Fi connection that we've always had with our computers. Now we're talking about appliances that are connected to the Internet. And those I would consider to be your macro scale examples. Okay. I'll take a real leap forward here with the latest information that I've been producing, and that is embedding nanoscale sensors in something as ubiquitous as food wrappers, food packaging, and the foods themselves. So that now you literally, as you purchase something in the store, it is transmitting a signal through the cloud to the, let's call it the distribution line, the supply chain, that something has just been purchased and needs to be restocked, and it has a trigger effect all the way back to the manufacturer, to the supplier. One of the things, I'll give you a tangible example, Walmart has rolled out a system of nanosensors in the packaging and in the shopping carts. that will sense, in the shopping cart specifically, the frustration level of a customer who's trying to locate a product, and it senses that frustration and transmits it within the store to a sales associate who is then directed to go to that customer, giving the associate the customer's location so that they can provide customer service.
How does it measure frustration in a person?
Because it is actually, and you don't have to have your hand on the handle of the shopping cart, it's embedded in the shopping cart and it is picking up the electrical impulses radiating from your body, from the cells in your body. It is actually picking up the changes in the waveform of the electrical, some people want to call it the aura, but our electrical signature it is picking up on and analyzing that signature.
So somebody has figured out what those changes in the signature mean in terms of things like frustration, stuff like that.
You could relate it in a sort of a half-cocked way. It's almost like a lie detector, which is noticing the changes in the galvanic response or conductivity of your skin to the sensors that are attached to your finger or attached to your chest.
Right, and with the lie detector, it sets a pattern right on the spot at the beginning of the interview.
Right.
Because it could be different for different people, right?
That's right, different baseline.
Yeah. So on all these technologies, there's two sides of them. There's what's presented to the public and how this is going to be wonderful and make your life a lot better, and it's super convenient to do all this stuff.
Yep.
Same reason they justified fast food restaurants and stuff. And
That's right.
And the other side is what is not in the newspaper so much, but what's actually the other purpose for it.
What's the price we have to pay for convenience?
Yeah, which could be intentional on the part of the people bringing it to us.
Well, I agree. My perspective as a Christian, as a Christian, my perspective is through the lens of the Holy Spirit. And so I do look at the nefarious side because I do think, and I'll kind of show you a springboard, a touch point of that. When we look at the word technology in the Greek, the word technology in the Greek is techne, T-E-C-H-N-E, or T-E-K-E, or T-E-K-N-E, techne. There's a couple of spellings in the Greek, but techne means the science of the crafts. We're talking about technology that is based on alchemy. We're talking about the dark arts. We're reaching back into the history of the crafts of the alchemists, and even before the classical sort of Renaissance picture of what an alchemist is, we even reach back into the binary system originating not necessarily in China, but it is associated with China, but reaching back into Africa to the research into Cantor sets. And beyond Cantor sets and the Fibonacci sequence, we go to geomancy, which is in the Arabic, and the Arabs got this from North Africa, is Il al-Ramal in the Arabic. Il al-Ramal means geomancy. Geomancy is the science of the sand, and it is the random generation of dots in the sand that are then interpreted and divined in a interdimensional spiritual communication system.
So geo means earth, right? Mm-hmm. So what does mancy mean?
It's the reading. It's the reading of the earth.
Okay, interesting. And you're saying that this aspect of the word technology was understood and used intentionally for thousands of years because you were going back to Old Greek, right? Yep. So it's not something that they recently decided. And most of the people using it now, of course, have no idea of that, I don't think. No. And you're saying maybe a few at the top level still do.
Sure. Those that really understand how the system operates, and there's a little phrase I always throw out, and that is that you cannot separate the physical from the spiritual.
Right.
When we talk about the science of the crafts technique, we're talking about crafts that were employed for communicating with spirits. Geomancy is a divination process, just like aquamancy and aeromancy and spatulamancy. These are considered the 7 dark arts for communication with spirits.
So these weren't nice spirits, right? They're specifically for nefarious purposes.
In the larger examination and in most of the literature that you read, I would say yes. But it's interesting when you get into the biblical history, the biblical narrative, you find, for example, Daniel, who's famous for interpreting the dream of King Nebuchadnezzar. And in that, he was practicing geomancy because Daniel was, let's in our terms, today we would consider him to be a professor. He would be a PhD level schooled individual.
So he wasn't trying to be harmful by that kind of geomancy at the time.
Correct. In fact, geomancy amongst the Pharisees and the Sadducees in the Hebraic cultures was their methodology that was approved, if you will. It was condoned by God himself for their communications with God. If you go to the Holy of Holies within the temple, within Solomon's temple, the Holy of Holies is a place where they use the black and white stones. I can never pronounce this properly, the Ulam and Thummim, but people will know this. But the black and white stones they carried in their vestments, the priests, when they went into the Holy of Holies to communicate with God, these black and white stones, much like we would see with the yin and yang or the I Ching from China, were used to toss those on the ground. And that was a form of geomancy. It was a form of divination, the interpretation of the stones. That was approved by God.
Is that like ones and zeros?
And you hit it right on the head, my friend. Absolutely. This is the binary system that we use today, that we call zeros and ones, has its absolute, and this is definitive, absolute roots in geomancy. Geomancy is something that characters like Aleister Crowley, Madame Blavatsky knew very well. We go back into Renaissance, we look at Edward Kelly and John Dee, who were paired up together, and they were practicing geomancy. And we go back even further to Ramon Lull, that's spelled L-U-L-L. Ramon Lull utilized geomancy. And that's a leaping off point that I'll hold back. But remember Ramon Lull, because we'll relate him to D-Wave and its operating system. Okay. But our binary system, as you go back through history and look at these scholars, literally, who had, like John Dee, he published 250 different books, tomes, on his communication with fallen angels in the Enochian language and the practice of geomancy. It's right there for the examination. It just takes the study to find it and see it. But the essence of what you're saying, yes, geomancy is a binary system of 0 and 1. It's a yes-no process.
Right, but it's a complex combination of yeses and nos that give you more information, right?
Absolutely correct, because there are what are known as 16 geomantic figures that are derived from seemingly random marks placed by an unskilled person in the sand and then interpreted by a person schooled in this, like Daniel was, in which they are recognizing the patterns in the sand. And this is what artificial intelligence does today, is pattern recognition, data pattern recognition. But 16 geomantic figures, and each of those have a specific title and have a specific meaning and storyline of interpretation, and that storyline is what is then given to the person seeking from the diviner, from the expert, right, the interpretation of the marks that they just made.
Sounds a lot like the I Ching book.
It is.
Where they give like a paragraph after each symbol and what it means and the story that goes with it and all that.
Absolutely correct. And so when we look at 16, that is in the base 2 system of mathematics. We utilize in computer programming base 2 mathematics.
Yeah, isn't that interesting that they chose base 2 instead of 3 or 4 or 5 or anything?
Or 10.
Or 10. Yeah, 10 because we're used to 10. Mm-hmm. There must have been something that they felt was an advantage, even though it's counterintuitive, of taking a lower base for more information or something. What do you think about it?
Well, I think it's because it gave them something that was easy to school the next generation in. It was a very simplistic system that you could school future generations in, a system that they could understand. And base 2 is very simple mathematics. It's multiplication.
Right. And then your black and white stones, or ones and zeros, or whatever point in the evolution you're looking at, that's like the carrier wave, right? If it's not influenced by a beginning of the line or the end of the line communicators trying to reach each other, if it's not influenced by their intent, then it becomes just a blank carrier wave. And it would be the intent that sets it up, right?
Intent, absolutely spot on, because the whole essence here is that the assumption by the person making the marks randomly, who's unschooled, and the assumption by the diviner is that the person making the random marks in the sand, or the tossing of the stones, and there are many other examples of that mechanics, but the assumption is the unschooled one who's randomly generating numbers. This is called stochastic random number generation. That unskilled person is somehow being influenced interdimensionally by spirits. And that's
just a person in the communication who doesn't happen to have a physical body.
Right.
Is one of the communicators, right? But
exactly.
Their intent is still radiating on whatever level, that frequency that can be picked up and change the randomness of the sign.
Correct.
Okay.
So it's the intent of that transmitter, that entity that is transmitting information to the unskilled, who then receives it, but it has to be interpreted, because there has to be an operating system, just like in a computer.
Yeah, and so the unskilled is really important. You don't want them to be skilled in the sense you're using the word, because they'd interfere with the message.
Correct.
Right? They have to be clear.
Absolutely.
And this is tied together with the quantum physics or mechanics idea that the experimenter influences the experiment. Yes. The experimenter in this case is the communicator.
You got it.
From each side.
Correct.
Okay.
Yes, you want the receiver to just receive. Be a detector, as we would call it in quantum mechanics.
Now, this could theoretically work between two people just sitting there physically, if they were really focused in their intent, right? They could change the appearance of the so-called random markers, whether numbers or stones or whatever.
And that I would explain through quantum entanglement, because that communication already exists. Our minds are quantum computers. All of the neurons, all of the synapses, all of the dendrites, all of the proteins, all of the DNA, RNA, all of that material is entangled amongst itself. And that, as a thinking mind with a consciousness and with a soul, that organic structure we call a brain, at the quantum scale, subatomic scale, its constituent material, you can go all the way down to C60 carbon. All of that material is entangled with another brain if we're sitting across from each other. But even across the planet, we can experience quantum entanglement with another person. And you said it, focus.
Yeah. If we were clear enough, we wouldn't need the telephone.
Correct.
Right.
That's right.
And the fact that the casinos are still in business means most people haven't gotten good at this.
And this is why we go back to the dark side of technology. Technology is ruining our ability to use quantum entanglement. I'm speaking from a Christian perspective, not a New Age perspective. I want to make that clear. I'm not putting down those that think in terms of New Age practices and viewpoints, because they actually are explaining what I'm explaining in quantum physics the same way. When we talk about an out-of-body experience, when we talk about influencing through telekinesis, when we talk about astral projection out into the cosmos,
right?
Quantum mechanics tells you we have those abilities to do that. I, from a Christian perspective, call that God's augmentation of us. We were created as perfect beings.
So most of our normal state we don't have access to right now, right?
That is correct. And technology is being employed to push us down and push us down to where we don't even think about exploring what you and I are talking about.
Right. I mean, when people came out with a calculator, at some point, almost nobody could do arithmetic in their head anymore.
That's right. We have to blame Texas Instruments and Hewlett-Packard for that.
Yeah. And I mean, people are losing the ability to do cursive writing.
Absolutely. I was just going to say that. See, we're entangled.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because that's exactly it. I have carpal tunnel, and I'm left-handed, predominantly left-handed. Oh. And I've spent so much time on the computer, I can barely write anymore because of my carpal tunnel.
Okay, right.
But people literally, and this is where even in the schools, children are not being taught cursive handwriting anymore.
Yeah. Yeah, because who would be walking around at all day or night without a computer of some kind?
That's right, and you've experienced this as we all do when we write. There's a physical connection with the paper and the pen or pencil.
Your intent has to be there.
It does. That's the brain being connected to it. When we use our keyboard, it's almost like automatic writing, isn't it?
It really easily can become that, especially if you're staring at the screen.
Exactly.
And picking up subliminal stuff or whatever's going on.
That's right. It's interfering with you. But when you write, you compose.
So humanity's being turned into some kind of zombies, I guess, right?
I think so. I think that this is the intent, is to, for example, there have been many studies of our IQ. And it is the chart, when you look at the graphs, just plummets worldwide, IQ assessments.
Yeah.
Just plummets.
So it's a successful program.
It is. And, I on my website, on my homepage, my little, dissertation on there about what I'm doing, I'm trying to encourage and instill in people the conscious effort, the conscious decision to think critically.
Right.
I think,
and maybe to try to do some things manually.
Yes.
Like they're saying that Bill Gates and the other really high-level technical people don't let their kids have any of these devices.
Steve Jobs didn't.
Right. Yeah, it wasn't because they couldn't afford them. It was actually different reasons. Huh?
Well, and we could talk about Steve and his travels in India and what he brought back and inspired the iPhone, but that's another show.
Yeah. Well, it's also, one of the shows that I can't mention because I don't want us to be banned right away. A really good newscaster that I refer people to. So one of his people did a study on kids' cartoons, and they looked at still frames of these cute little animals that were running around as the stars. And in the pupil of the eye were all these satanic symbols and stuff like that. And, you'd have to stop the frame to see any of that stuff.
That's
and the
right.
kids were just staring at it, absorbing all this stuff. And
that truly is subliminal.
That's nothing compared to what is probably coming through all the computers.
Yeah, let's step back to geomancy for a moment, because this is interdimensional communication. When I reference Daniel from the Bible, he was approved by God to communicate with him that way, the same as the priest did. Mm-hmm. But once Daniel interpreted Nebuchadnezzar's dream, he was told by God to seal up the book until the latter days. In a very short presentation, I'm saying today, we're in the latter days, and I'm not instilling fear in people. I'm simply sharing the evidence.
Yeah.
But the book of Daniel, in my opinion, from what I've read and been exposed to, the book of Daniel has been unsealed. The book is open. And what is contained in the book? It is the knowledge that you and I are sharing right now with our audience.
Mm-hmm.
People like you and I, and many people in our audience, and because they're in your audience, they are this kind of person. They are a person who is a critical thinker, a person who is still independently thinking, who is asking questions, who wants to know what is going on in the world. Why is life changing the way it is? When we look at technology, things like 5G, things like AI and quantum computing and blockchain, where does this come from? Who's motivating this? Who's pushing the agenda? This isn't conspiracy theory. This is asking questions. But this is a result of the book of Daniel, in my opinion, the book of Daniel being opened, that we are being made aware enough to even ask the questions. You have to know enough to even ask the right questions.
Right.
And therefore, you and I and others like us are being prodded, I believe, by God through the Holy Spirit. And I don't know anything about your spiritual background, but I know you as a friend in what we're doing here to help people. And that is that we are being shown enough to trigger us to ask questions and to seek the information.
Yeah, I don't think we'd have a clue if it wasn't just given to us by grace, actually.
I agree.
I think that's the prodding that you're talking about. And so it gives you a responsibility to do it well. And a lot of things that come up in questions about technology are variations of the idea, is it being used for harm or for damage? And it was like, because it's a tool. It's not intrinsically good or bad, because it can be used in different ways. But I think it's like in the origin of what was supposed to be medicine, which was not poisonous chemicals with bad effects. The idea was first do no harm, according to Hippocrates. Yeah. And if that has been abandoned by the medical industry now completely, but it's considered normal to have medicine that kills you. But in technology in general, if it were applied, we'd have something other than 5G, and it would work better. It wouldn't hurt you.
That's right.
Seems to me.
I think we would be given our natural ability to communicate with our minds.
Yeah.
Between our minds.
Yeah. A lot of the old indigenous tribes, before they got really degraded, were able to do that even in recent times, across mountain ranges and things. And they would just say, hi, we want to have a meeting, but they wouldn't say it verbally. And the people would show up running for the meeting. And they didn't think was anything unusual. And they didn't have any nefarious purpose. Right. It was just normal. And I think we're just really far away from what should be normal.
There was a language in the Bible that Adam and Eve used before the fall, and that was called the Enochian language, the language of Enoch, as Enoch described it in the book of Enoch. The Enochian language was the language of the angels, the communicating between Adam and Eve and angels and God himself. And, we can extrapolate that and imagine, but, I just look at it as quantum entanglement. I was interviewed a couple of years ago by a fellow Christian who asked me, he said, and I wasn't set up for this. I wasn't, there was no premonition or precognition, if you will, or whatever, but it hit me out of the blue. He said, can you describe in quantum mechanics what it means when we pray with Jesus Christ?
Mm-hmm.
And it hit me in an instant. I'm nobody special. To understand, I'm not a prophet or anybody. I'm a guy who asks a lot of questions.
Mm-hmm.
But I described it as quantum entanglement with Jesus Christ. When we pray with him, we have that immediate communication with no time delay. And it doesn't have to be audible or anything else, but you have that sense of your being heard and you're receiving answers, information back. And I think this is what Adam and Eve had the ability to do before the fall. I think this is what we are being prevented from discovering about ourselves.
Yeah. I think it's variations of that are the biggest fear of the power structure, because if we find out who we are, not in theory, but actually experience it and start being normal again, then the negative power structure has nothing they can do to us at that point.
And that's why I always try to say this is not about fear-mongering. We're not trying to scare people. We're giving touch points. We're giving directions for critical thinking, for asking questions, for exploring on your own.
Yeah.
And the best way for people to reach an understanding about any topic is through their own epiphany, their own discovery.
Yeah.
It doesn't do any good if we're teachers if they don't go out and research on their own.
Right. And that line that you said that people had to anybody that they wanted to communicate with, or in your case, you were saying with Jesus, the line's there all the time. It's just what changed is a focused intent.
Exactly.
Right? Even if no one sees you say anything. And that's available to anybody all the time.
It is focused intent, absolutely. And let's talk a little bit about DNA, RNA, and Native Americans.
Okay.
Because when they're across a mountain range and they're communicating non-verbally, I think a lot of that comes from shared DNA. Our DNA holds memories, generational memories. In the Bible, it describes it as 4 generations of DNA moving information from one generation to the other. And when we have focused intent, we unzip the DNA, we unzip the chromosome, we release the expression of the DNA. It expresses by sending literally an electrical current from the DNA through to the mind, where proteins are the expression of DNA. The proteins manufacture and produce the branches that connect our neurons, known as dendrites. And between any 2 neurons, there are as many as 250,000 dendrites just between the neurons. And we have, numbers vary with who you talk to, but somewhere in the neighborhood of 10 billion neurons in the human mind. And, you know, President Obama instituted a program when he was in office called the mind mapping program, the mind mapping system, akin to the human genome mapping that preceded it. And scientists, to this point, in terms of quantum mechanics, they are assigning in this examination of the dendrites, in terms of dimensions, that there may be as many as 54 mathematically represented dimensions in the tree-like structure of the branching of our dendrites. So who are we to say that we don't have the ability to communicate our thoughts to one another that may be thoughts that have a historical origin in our DNA?
Yeah.
That we're more attuned to those of our own blood.
Right. No, I completely agree, but I would say that there are different levels of this kind of potential communication as well. And if you're on the DNA level, it's easier with compatible DNA types, but there are other levels. And that when you become aware of yourself as a non-physical being who's inhabiting a conscious costume for the moment, and you communicate at the non-physical level completely, then there's no DNA restriction.
Ah, okay.
And that gets really interesting, right along the lines of what you're saying.
So there's no DNA restriction, and we're talking about literally just at the dendrite and neuron and synapse levels of communicating signals, producing signals
what I'm
from the
talking
mind.
about isn't coming from the dendrites at all,
Okay.
because I'm differentiating between mind and brain. And I'm saying mind is not a physical entity, and it uses the brain. The brain is just a really well-made piece of the body.
Sure.
But since we're not physical beings, and I don't want to divert us into this,
No, but you're going to the spiritual side.
well, yeah, because spiritual essentially equating to reality once you really get into it, and the rest is like reflection of that on different levels of spin and vibration. So
Exactly.
where the mind and the brain work together, because since we're non-physical, completely non-physical beings in our original state,
Yep.
that since the physical world wasn't even existing in our original state, then we needed an interface between us and the almost infinite information that defines this plane of existence. And that interface was mind. And that survives the physical body.
Completely agree with you.
Okay, well, I thought you were going to tell me I was crazy, but
No, because it starts spiritual. We were first a spiritual, and if we have to be physics about it, we were energy. We were a waveform. When God spoke the universe into existence and everything that's in it, the act of speaking, as we understand sound, is an energy wave. And when we look at it from the cosmological and the particle physics and the quantum mechanics standpoint, if we're imagining the Big Bang scenario, I don't adhere to the Big Bang, but if we use that as a common touch point, at the moment of the Big Bang, first there was energy, then there was matter derived from energy. So God, as the creator speaking it, he projects the energy that then collapses the waveform, if we observe it, into the matter that we are existing with. But the mind starts with that intent, the intent of God, the Spirit of God, and we carry that Spirit in us.
yeah. If you really analyzed us, I don't think you'd find a difference, because there was nothing to make us out of except the original essence. And
Agreed.
I'm just saying that consciousness, which all these words are inadequate, but
Yeah,
consciousness meaning that from which energy and light and matter and everything came from. So there's something before any of that was created, including energy, that was the essence of what still exists now, but we're diverted by the reflection. So
Yes.
if we could get more in touch with what's being reflected, everything would change. And I think we wouldn't even have to destroy the bad guys. We would be healing them by resonance. Because
they're humans just like us.
yeah, they're spirit originally, and there was only one origin of all these spirits. So they took on different programming than we did, playing the role in this movie of the bad guys. But if we go below that and approach them without the programming, I think by resonance that Tesla was talking about, but on a higher level, that they're going to start thinking, whoa, I don't want to do any of this stuff. Well, I had no idea this is who I was. Why have I been playing this role? And I think that's their biggest fear, is that only a few of us would be taken to actually activate that.
They've, as is often bantied around, the term compartmentalized. So they have been compartmentalized. We have too.
Yeah,
It's
they think that's who they are.
Yeah.
I mean, if we were looking through their eyes with their background and their mind programs and everything, we'd do exactly what they're doing.
Correct.
So hating anybody is not required. In fact, it's counterproductive.
It's completely counterproductive. And in fact, when we go to the operating of our brain, if we focus on the negative, that actually is destructive. And we build the improper form of dendrite tree, versus if we're looking at it through the lenses of love, that we're trying to all get along, that we're not trying to label somebody as the enemy, as the evil bad guy. That's just another human being over there that needs what I want to share. But, by the grace of God, I mean, I could be just that person, as you just
exactly.
said. So
and in a way,
you judge anybody.
You are that person in them.
Yes.
Because not only are you entangled, the reason you even can be entangled is you're really one being.
Exactly. We are one being.
So that makes sense when it says love your neighbor as yourself, right? Because it is yourself.
Yeah, and love your enemy.
Yeah, exactly, because that's superficial.
It is totally superficial, and it is when you get into this kind of mindset that you and I are sharing with the audience, my reaction is not one of anger. It's one of laughing, because it's the absurdity of how we've been duped. And you can say whoever is the causality of the duping, of the misleading, the deception that we're operating under. But the level that you and I are talking about is so beyond most people in terms of their everyday thinking processes. What you and I are driven by is really to share this opportunity to see beyond the labels and the structures and the boundaries that have been created by man in what I call his hubris. We are so full of ourselves.
Right, which is just a reflection of being out of touch.
Yeah.
Because, the opposite of what you just described with those words, including hubris and everything, that kind of fake pride is because you don't know the reality. And once you get in touch with what's going on, there's no possibility of having the ego-type pride at all.
No, the pride goes right out the window.
It's not usable for anything except deceiving yourself. So,
and oftentimes our pride comes from this material view of the world. And I don't mean just consumerism, but it is this sense of the only thing that exists is that which I can materially interact with. Yeah. What we're talking about going beyond is the material to the spiritual, and understand that when we pass on from this, sack of water, we go back to being spiritual. We were created in the perfect image of God. However you want to define and label God.
It doesn't mean you have the right length nose or anything like that.
Right. And who cares about what car you drive, what house you have, whether you're a billionaire, whether you're Jeff Bezos, the wealthiest man in human history, exceeding Solomon and by King Solomon by some accounts. Yeah. Who cares? He's just a man. He's just a person who's going to pass into his spiritual form. And in my perspective, there's an accountability for how we behave here.
Right.
But that's another.
Well, your consciousness instantaneously puts that into motion, because it's always trying to drag you back to reality. And I think, we just want that one being in all these forms to be okay and conscious of and enjoying its real state. So I think there's most of those people who are playing severe roles and consciously working toward exterminating life on the planet and things, which is not just a mistake. If we want to reach them and bring back harmony, all we have to do is be who we actually are while we're still here. And then the resonance effect is going to take care of the rest, I think.
Well, you're more than aware of the butterfly effect and what I also call the pebble in the pond. I mean, the things that you and I are doing, not because we're special people, we just happen to be asking questions and passing on things that we have become aware of to other people so they can ask questions. But we are those pebbles in the pond. We are those butterfly effects. One man can't make a difference.
A really big difference. And I think the message to the audience is that whoever you have thought you are, you're a lot more than that, and you're a spectacular being. And the biggest fear of those trying to control things because of their misconceptions is that you might wake up to that, not by being able to recite things, but your experience of being something much bigger, which
knowing
is just normal. Yeah.
You know it.
You know it by experience. It's like a direct perception.
It is. And, if someone is sitting there listening to us and saying, well, I can't get on the radio, and I can't write books, I can't publish a magazine, I can't. You start with your own mind and realize that you're entangled with everybody else. And you start with, how do you think and view the world? If you are always negative, you're always down, you're always looking at that fear-based system, which is unfortunately what we've all been immersed in, is a fear-based society. If you force yourself, you talk about focus, if you direct your thoughts to the positive, if you think in terms of your neighbor who you can't stand because he plays, heavy metal music at 3 a.m.
Right.
If you change your thinking about that person to realize that that person is a part of you, that they're connected with you, they are you, then you start to shift to a positive way of thinking of that person. And it might be that you might just have the guts in a very nice way to walk over and knock on the guy's door and say, could we have a cup of coffee together?
Yeah.
Whatever it is, it's that mindset of being predominantly negative or predominantly positive. The stuff that I read, people have asked me in my audience, why don't you get depressed? Why aren't you afraid of the future? Well, I have my faith and my belief, and that underscores that. But without pushing that on people, I'm just saying, change the way you think. And I'm not going to pontificate here and puff myself up, but I just want to share with you in the audience, I'm 65 years old. Okay? I don't think I look 65. At least that's what people tell me.
Yeah.
I have a wife who's 10 years younger than me. Okay? That isn't bragging. I'm just saying I have to keep up with her.
Exactly. Right?
So if I was down in the dumps, if I was depressed, if I was worried about the future and all the things that you and I see and we're aware of, I wouldn't be able to be a good husband to her. I wouldn't be able to be in good health. I don't take any medications. I take a small groupings of, vitamins and supplements. You can educate me more about what I need to do. But the point is, the way you think affects your body. If you hate your neighbor, it's going to destroy your body.
Yeah.
Along with your mind.
Because of the entanglement.
Because of the entanglement.
Yeah. I agree. And also you said people might say, well, I can't be on the radio. How am I going to influence anybody? I would remind them that they are on the radio.
Yeah.
And it's a broadcast system that is much more powerful and subtle than the little stuff that we're using this morning.
It sure is.
Because of the entanglement that you explained, they're actually reaching everybody.
Let's be specific.
They might want to broadcast consciously because of that fact.
There are folks, I'm sure, like me, who like to define things and get down to the finer points. And there are people that are mechanically oriented. So I'll share with you. We talk about the spin of quantum particles. We talk about focusing. Let's change the spin of the quantum particles in our own mind first. Focus on our own mind and say, if I'm thinking of the negative and I'm building tree branches of dendrites in my mind, that are fractured, that are breaking, that are leading to negative thoughts and negative behavior, I'm going to change my mind at the quantum scale by focusing on the quantum particles. Pick a particle, a proton, an electron, a neutron, whatever you want, but just say to yourself, and this isn't, I don't have a book of DVD, a book and DVDs to sell to you to teach you how to do this. I'm just saying, if you are mechanically oriented and you want something specific to focus on, think about the little particles that are spinning up and the ones that are spinning down and say, I'm going to focus on physically changing the spin of my quantum particles and just see what happens.
Right.
It sounds ridiculous.
Well, your feedback mechanism is how you feel as a result.
Yeah.
If you get a dark feeling or heavy or oppressive or fearful or angry or anything, it's not the right direction. That in science, feeling is really denigrated as nothing. It's it's not scientific. It's anecdotal. It's all kinds of things, and not logical. And really, there's this massive ability to pick up very subtle things that guide you. And I think somewhere in all the scriptures you're talking about, it says if you know yes and no, you've got it covered.
Yes.
That's one aspect of the ones and zeros on a non-material level. Because if you know, project yourself into the future you create if you do a certain thing, see what it feels like, and project yourself into taking the other path, see what that feels like, and if you can be receptive enough, you know which one to take.
That's right.
That's a 1 and a 0, right?
You'll feel the positive instead of the negative, and it is a 1 and a 0. And I think that we tend to think in yes, no. So we go way back to the beginning of our conversation about the binary system and geomancy and why geomancy was binary. It's because we tend to be very simplistic in our thinking of yes, no. I'm going to do this or I'm not going to do this.
Yeah.
We are binary. So let's go back to the human brain. We look at a neuron, and contained within the neuron are subcomponents called microtubules. And within the microtubules, we have tubulin dimers. Dimers are pairs by definition, D-I-M-E-R-S, dimers, and they are literally a 0 and a 1. So the geomancy reflects how the mind already structurally is arranged. So we have dimers within microtubules that form our neurons that are connected by the branching dendrites that are formed by proteins that are expressions of our DNA.
Right. So if you, like what you were saying, start with yourself, whatever we become, we're broadcasting because of entanglement. So you don't even, if the powers that be are fooling around with 5G and 6G and 10G or whatever, you're already infinite G, just not using it at full capacity.
Right. And that takes the fear out of the 5G. Now, I'm going to speak as a Christian again for a moment, take a little liberty here, but my way of dealing with 5G and other things like that is to take on the full armor of God. The Holy Spirit providing the full armor of God. I've explained to my audiences that is, from a physics standpoint, a physical shield against 5G.
Yeah.
And
I totally agree with that.
We have that ability with our mind. We take out the theological, if you will, the Christianese, take that out of the discussion and just think in terms of, I can use my mind, the power of my mind, because it literally is spiritual power that manifests as a waveform in science and manifests as quantum particles. My mind can literally shield me from those energy waves being transmitted in the form of 5G. If you look at it in the military structure, they have electronic countermeasures, ECM. They're broadcasting signals that counter the enemy's signals.
Right.
We do that with our mind. Electronic countermeasures, we can use our own mind through quantum entanglement, and our thought process, our mind, our conscience, we can focus and say, I rebuke that 5G signal. I repel that 5G signal with my mind. You cannot transmit the signals you're trying to transmit into my head, the old voice to skull technology discussion.
Yeah.
I rebuke it. I, as a Christian, say I rebuke it in the name of Jesus Christ. But if you take it and just take it as a mechanical process, you can send out your electronic countermeasures with your own mind, with your own spirit. And that system out there, 5G or whatever, is so weak compared to what we have as a perfect being. This is why I laugh in the face of this stuff, because it is so infantile in comparison to what we have as our abilities.
There have been some really interesting experiments verifying what you're saying in a, I guess, some kind of a really fine physics way, in that identifying a counter-rotating, meaning one part moving clockwise and one part moving counterclockwise against each other, spinning, and another part in the same space stationary, that is actually a very complex, multi-layered energy field around the human being, everybody, but in many people it's not activated. And in its normal state, which is fully moving very fast, it's programmable by things like what you just said, which means you use your intent at a certain level of focus, you can make it continue that particular energy. And so it can be programmed to protect against things like you're saying, and experiments have been done showing it doing that. And that's actually available around each person.
Yes.
Gets really interesting.
The quantum mechanics side of what you just described, the contra-rotating electrons spinning in opposite directions, is exactly what takes place in quantum computing. In the chipset, and I'm speaking specifically about D-Wave, the leader in this,
yeah,
but the others like IBM have been following suit. In the chipset, you send a stream of electrons in a circular pathway in one direction, simultaneously another stream of electrons in the other direction, just like you described. And from that, they are able to then produce superposition, as they describe it, of zeros and ones. A zero can manifest as a one, and a one can manifest as a zero simultaneously. That's because mechanically you have this simultaneous but in opposite direction flow of electrons. Mm-hmm. Now here's the interesting thing that leaps over to CERN, the Large Hadron Collider in Geneva, Switzerland. The main ring of the LHC, which is one of several, but the main ring, 27 kilometers in length, sends streams of protons in opposite directions, contra-rotating, simultaneously at 99.999% the speed of light.
Right.
The quantum computer at D-Wave at the chipset level, which is a macro-sized chip, it's not subatomic, but it operates quantumly. That chipset in quantum mechanics operates identically to a 27-kilometer accelerator and collider 300 feet under the ground in Geneva. The mechanics are identical. Therefore, the quantum computer at D-Wave and the collider, because they share the same quantum mechanics, are both quantum computers. A collider as a computer.
Right.
I don't think you've heard that anywhere else.
No.
But you can't escape the mechanics, is my point.
Yeah.
So they're replicating what the body is doing.
Right, but they can never totally match it, right?
No.
It's coming from a synthetic origin.
And it is very adolescent in its level of development.
So the only way they can continue to look really impressive and intimidating and everything is if we stay totally unconscious.
Correct. Ask this average person, have you ever heard of CERN? Have you ever heard of D-Wave? No.
Right.
But even deeper, the consciousness level that you're talking about, if they can keep us, let's go to the brain again. If they take us from the prefrontal cortex, the cerebellum, the cerebrum, and shift us down to our brainstem level where we think in terms of fight or flight, instincts, autonomic nervous system.
Fear all the time.
Exactly. If they shove you through fear down to the brainstem level of thinking, then they can keep us from thinking critically and keep us from seeing the things that you and I are discussing today.
Yeah, no perception.
Through fear.
Right.
That's why I laugh at it. You can't scare me.
Yeah, but you found out that the secret that fear is optional.
It is optional.
And they're trying to make you think that you have to have fear. It's going to protect you from these terrible things. And then, so you take on fear and it creates all the terrible things.
Self-fulfilling prophecy.
Yeah. 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 But we've been trained really thoroughly that this happens and this is how you have to feel.
And if you don't feel right, here's the chemical to take.
Yeah, exactly. So if they can keep your health really under stress all the time, so that your body's hurting and really uncomfortable constantly, that helps keep you unconscious. And then all the fake education that we get, the fake science that the public is given, and the fake entertainment that contains all these self-destructive archetypes that you're supposed to emulate and stuff like that. It's all to keep you from becoming self-aware.
That's right.
So that you're not a threat to the system.
You know, and we come from slightly different starting points in the things that we're studying, but you and I are talking the same language today.
Yeah, I think so. It's really neat. And the same essence is inside everybody, including the bad guys. So that's our potential solution to the whole thing, I think. If we were really all different, it wouldn't be possible.
Many times in my broadcasts, I have reached out by name the leaders in various sectors and have said, I am not your enemy.
Right.
Okay? I'm here trying to save your soul, because as a Christian, that's my thing.
Yeah.
You know, that's my calling, that's my purpose. But you can call it in any label that you choose, but you're really trying to reach out to these guys and say, look, you're going down a destructive path for yourself. Right. One of these days, you're going to find out who you're serving. You're going to find out how destructive all of this really is that you're putting in place.
Yeah, and it's just, you know, it looks selfish if you don't understand it, but really it's self-destructive. If you're trying to hurt anybody else, you're trying to hurt yourself, no matter what the justification is. And
their justification oftentimes, again, because I read their materials, is one example is this whole idea of immortality.
Right.
This transhumanism, this uploading of your mind, your thoughts, your consciousness, digitizing yourself into a computer and separating yourself from a physical body so that you're now achieving some form of immortality. Right. Well, excuse me, I don't want to live in a computer.
No, and it's not going to work anyway.
No.
But believing that leads them to do some unpleasant things.
Correct. That's what's motivating them.
Yeah. Yeah, I see it as a ceremonial sacrifice of the biosphere.
Agreed.
I think they intend complete extermination.
Agreed.
But I'm not encouraging anybody to worry about that. It's just that with the strategic awareness that that's what they're doing, they're coming off a lot of false presumptions, and it's not really hard for us to get beyond it so that even they can be changed by resonance, even if you don't say a thing.
Sure.
You're broadcasting to them now, and what you broadcast is can be upgraded just by becoming self-aware, step by step. I think.
Believe it does from someone who looks at cause and effect. And take my ego out of this. Don't even factor in that I'm making something more of myself than I am when I say this, and that is, when these guys listen to my show, and I have definitive proof through LinkedIn and other places that they listen to my shows, the things that I talk about show up in their literature.
Right.
Show up on their company websites. I only say that because I'm reinforcing what you're saying. Through our mind, through our consciousness, through our quantum entanglement with everybody, we do have an effect. Believe that you do have an effect. I'm not saying just take it on faith. I'm saying from an evidentiary experience.
Yeah.
We have an effect on these guys. Now, I'm going to get a T-shirt made, and this is sidestepping.
Yeah.
But a few years ago, CERN had a problem with the collider. They had a power shutdown, and it caused an automatic safety systems to quench the magnets and all this other stuff. They had thousands of bus bars that were melted, short-circuited, all this stuff. They claim, let's say it's true, but they claim at CERN the causality to this power disruption and this shutting down was because a weasel, the critter, a weasel, chewed through one of their power cables at the above-ground power substation. And they found this weasel, of course, fried.
Right.
But I'm going to have a T-shirt made that says, "Remember the weasel."
Yeah, that was really selfless of that weasel to, go through with that action.
He was an instrument of God.
Yeah, exactly.
And that's underscoring my point. Don't be afraid of the technology, because little things like a weasel can get in the way. This huge collider complex, largest, most expensive, most complex system in recorded human history. They have seismometers that if there is a 3.0 or greater, it shuts it all down. God can bring in a little 4.0 tremor and their day is done.
Right.
For years. For years, it'll be done.
Right.
Anyway, don't worry about the technology. It's so adolescent and so fragile. I'm speaking to the audience.
Yeah.
Don't be afraid of it. It's a joke.
No, we're like in a wrestling match being held down with one finger of a 2-pound opponent, and they can, oh no, I can't move. There's no way out.
It's all real, though. That's all real wrestling. Sure, it's not scripted. Sure.
Right.
Don't be afraid of it. But it is amazing, the technology that is out there. And we were going to talk about quantum computers and AI and blockchain and a new blockchain company and all these things. And I know we don't have time for that today. I'm not cutting you short. I'll go as long as you want.
No, I think
this has been a great conversation.
Yeah, I agree. And maybe you'd be willing to do more installments of it at some point later on, too.
Sure, absolutely. Yeah.
So if we wanted to leave people with a bottom line to remember that you think is most important from all this detail, what would you want them to remember?
That technology has a dark origin, but don't be afraid of the darkness. Technology has a dark origin, but don't be afraid of the darkness. That's what I would leave them with.
Right. I think that's beautiful. It covers pretty much everything, so they can digest that. Okay, well, thank you, and hold on for a minute, and we'll say goodbye in a little break here.
All right.
Okay, so there goes Anthony Patch. I thought he was great today, and I really learned a lot about what he's doing and the interplay between technology, the reason it's being used, and another reason why it's important for us to be in a good state so that the negative agenda for life on Earth gets reversed for the benefit of all of us, and including the guys who are mistakenly using it for enjoyed it. I was hoping we wouldn't scare people away by him being too technical, but I think that he explained everything, all of the technical stuff, in a really relatable manner, and that was great. The best teachers of complex subjects like that are not just the ones who can show you how, they know all this stuff that nobody else can understand. The good teachers are the ones that can be translating it into normal language and still be accurate. And I think Anthony has a lot of talent in that direction. So anyway, thanks for being with us, and I appreciate sharing it with you. Remember, our other Sunday shows are coming up every week with inspiring people on them, and we're making as many free videos during the week as possible. Watch for the live streams as well as the Blog Talk radio shows. And as I was saying, you're always welcome in Planetary Healing Club if you get to the point of really seriously wanting to work on this with a support group that's interested in the same thing as you. I'm there every week in person, live, and it's interactive, so it's a pretty neat experience. Other than that, it's just an encouragement to work on yourself, because that's where the hidden PowerPoint is. If you do it alone or with a friend or in any situation, that's the main value of our time, and it's not like you can only do it separately when you're not doing anything else. The point is to do it in the background all the time, and that's what gives power to the rest of what you do. So that's all I had to say. Thanks for being with us, and we'll look forward to seeing you soon.